フルバージョンならピボットアプリ。
You're saying Japan is not back yet.
Japan is not back. If the economy were really doing well, we would see a very different thing. But if you look at changes in society, generational attitudes, it's really quite exciting for people creating companies, younger, ambitious, which if they become big enough,
People are starting to believe that Japan is back.
Japan could be back. If it does the right things, yes, we can. Japan can do it. We should not all be so fatalistic, shikatakanai, right? Japan can do it.
So Richard Katz, welcome to Pivot, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So you've been observing the Japanese economy for decades, and we're just talking about your book about Kusariyuku. What is the title again?
Nihon toいう system Kusariyuku.
Nihon, okay. And now you have your new book, The Contest for Japan's Economic Future, Entrepreneurs versus Corporate Giants. So today we're going to talk about your book and the future of the economy and whether Japan's kusatteru or not. But first of all, we want to talk about the Japanese stocks because, since the beginning of the year, people all over the world are not only talking about S&P 500, but also Nikkei. And it's about to reach the historical 3,800, maybe within the year.
Right.
What are you thinking about this stock rally?
You know what? People will say, gee, this means Japan is back.
Yes.
All right. Ever since the bubble popped in 1990, every decade, they say Japan is back because there's some combination of a burst in stock prices and promises of reform. So under Prime Minister Hashimoto, and then under Koizumi, and then under Abe, and now it's Kishida's turn. But the stock market does not reflect any comeback in the economy, nor does it predict any comeback in the economy. It's purely a stock market phenomenon. So if you look at the stock market, has gone up tremendously, not only this year, but in the last 6 years, right? Tremendously, except for the COVID period. On the other hand, GDP is no higher today than it was 6 years ago. So the economy has not recovered from the second consumption tax hike under Abe and then COVID. Moreover, real compensation per employee is actually less than it was 6 years ago. So why is the stock market rising? Right. This is purely financial manipulation. The Japan Exchange has ordered companies that wish to remain in the prime section to raise their stock price. How do you raise your stock price? The stock price really reflects how much profit do you make per share, right? So now, there are two ways to raise, say if you want to double your stock price. One way is to actually double your profits. That's not hard. That's not easy. That's the hard way.
Yes.
That's the hard way. And corporations have been raising their profits, but by cutting wages, not by becoming more efficient. They're not more efficient, but they're cutting wages. But the easy way to double your stock price is to buy back your shares and cut in half the number of shares. So if you're earning 10 million yen, and you have 10 million shares, right, then your price is 1. But if you have the number of shares, you have now still 1 million profits, but only 500,000 in shares, your price is 2. That's what's going on. Mitsubishi Corp just announced it's going to buy back 10% of its shares. The stock went nuts. That does not benefit anybody in the economy except for smart investors. Smart investors can earn a lot of money right now, but you can't keep buying your shares forever.
Right.
And at some point, the manipulation stops. And then all the foreign money that's coming in will go right back out again.
Do you think, so we have a graph you prepared for us. So you're comparing Nikkei and GDP. So you're arguing that Nikkei is
up 60% since.
Yes. But the GDP is
flat. Right, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And compensation, which is not in that chart, is actually down a bit.
I see. However, I would like to kind of challenge that because a lot of people are saying that Japan's really changing and Japan's back. It's different from 10 years or 20 years ago because people are saying, for instance, PBR, so the Tokyo Stock Exchange is listing companies, the price book ratio below 1 to show improvement. And I feel companies are getting the message and starting to change. Do you think that, or that's not happening still yet?
Yeah, you could raise the price to book ratio again by buying back your shares.
So it's not real demand.
So what the figure to look at is the profits compared to all of your assets. So you have your factory, your land, your office, your equipment, financial assets, etc. So that's called return on assets or ROA. If companies were really improving, the ROA would be rising. But in fact, it's no higher than it was in the 1990s. So this is simply, it's not true. It's not true. In other words, the productivity would be growing. Moreover, to the extent that companies have improved profits, the main way they've improved profits, and I have a chart on this which we can look at, right? Which is sales per worker is actually flat since 1994. Wages per worker are actually going down since 1994. But profits are way up. Why? Because they're cutting wages. Now, question is, if they're cutting wages, who's buying the products? Right? If you're not paying people enough, they can't afford to buy your products. Personal consumption spending is no higher than 2014, 10 years ago. That means someone else has to buy the products. Who buys the products? Well, then the government has to run a budget deficit year after year after decade after decade. And then you keep interest rates at zero to try to get companies to invest for a quarter of a century, actually 30 years now. Or you send the yen down to really, really cheap levels. Because you can no longer compete on the basis of premium products and premium prices. You have to cut your prices to sell. So you have the foreigners providing demand. But when you cheapen the yen, that means that people have to pay more for food, for energy. And so you're, again, cutting living standards. So if the economy were really doing well, we would see a very different thing.
So you're saying Japan is not back yet?
Japan is not back. And some of the companies with the low price to book ratio, they deserve it. They're bad companies. But other companies, you take Nikon Camera, okay? So this fantastic company, or Canon, it's actually a superb company. The problem is that the market changed, right? Who's making the cameras now? It's the smartphone makers, right? It's not the camera makers. Now Sony provides sensors for them, and they're very good at it, right? So Nikon's market just fell apart. So Nikon now is trying to remake itself, just like Fujifilm, or what used to be called Fujifilm, right? Remade itself. That is very hard to do. Some companies can do it. Hitachi is doing it very well. So you can always point to some exceptional companies like Hitachi, like Fujifilm, but it's really, really hard to do.
So you mentioned about sensors and Hitachi, and some people argue that Japan is maybe not good at making the final product, but good at making niche products or in-between materials or machines. Do you agree with that, or it's just exception?
But there's this theory that, there are a lot of niche products. And if you add up all the different niche products, it's a lot. But it's not true. There's a list that Nido, which is a part of METI, created about 900 different sectors.
I saw the map of the list.
And Japan has the largest market share in the smallest niches. So there are, if you look at all the products where Japan has got more than 50% global market share, the average size of the market is only $200 million. So yes, there's the niche is there, but the aggregate, the total of the niche is very tiny. In fact, in those products, the Americans and the Europeans and the Chinese actually have a larger share of total sales in the products where they have a dominant share. So no, this is it's not an accurate story. It doesn't say that Japan is back. I mean, some companies can do very well, but there's not enough of them in enough products to drive recovery of the overall economy. On the other hand, if I can say this, so Japan, we can get into why, but in the analog era, Japan was terrific. But we're now in the digital era, and the Japanese companies have not mastered that for reasons we can talk about. But these are old companies, and old companies in every country in the world find it hard to change their ways, particularly if they're very successful. And then they recruit people who think like themselves. Then it's really hard to change when times change. So of the top 26 Japanese electronics hardware companies, only one was created after 1959, so they're very old. And during 2008 to 2020, at a time when the global sales of electronics products were soaring, of the top 10 Japanese hardware electronics companies, every single one of them had falling sales, whether they produced in Japan or overseas. Sony tried to produce PCs and tablets and e-readers, but they could not produce one that would compete. Now the exception, which is, I think it was 12th last time, but Katz is doing great, but that's the exception. So there are always exceptions you can point to, but what it tells you is Japanese companies could be excellent again, but they have to change their ways. And Katz operates very differently than so many other companies.
Let's talk about wages and interest rates because, for instance, Suntory, Ninami-san said the wages will go, I think, 7% this year. And also, the Bank of Japan will change its policy and the interest rate will go. So how are you seeing that effect? Or is it a positive effect or what's your observation?
Well, it's a very positive effect if more companies did it.
Yes.
So what happened was, and we saw this last year, so the companies involved in the shunto raised their wages a lot compared to the past.
Right.
But if you look at the base wage, not as much as the headline, but still, it was important.
Yes.
But these employ far less than 10% of the entire workforce. And people assumed that the same kind of wage hike that the big companies were paying would spread to all the SMEs that employ most of the people. And it didn't. Wages, the Bank of Japan said, in order to achieve 2% inflation, you have to have 3% growth in nominal wages. And I won't get into the reasons for the arithmetic of that, but say 3% was the goal. They've never even come close. So what happened was, because the SMEs did not do it, one reason is the cheap yen means the SMEs are now paying more for energy and their inputs, right? So they can't afford it.
That's true.
So the cheap yen helped the big exporters, but did not help the companies that employed most of the people. Now, people say the shunto will be even bigger this year. Well, that's very good for the people who work for big companies. And in fact, it's great. Companies have so much cash. They should be using it not to buy their shares back, but to pay their workers more, so those workers can spend more, and we don't need as big a budget deficit. But you cannot assume that because the shunto figure looks good, that the overall wage of the typical worker in Japan will look good, particularly the non-regular workers, whose wages are so low. So people are saying 80% chance the Bank of Japan will loosen interest rates.
Right.
And in December, they said 80% chance in January. And then every time, it's the next few months, 80%.
Next month, next month, yes.
It might happen.
Yeah.
But the Bank of Japan said it needed clear evidence that the wages were rising. We will not have clear evidence by April. So if the bank does raise rates as early as April, it is really going back on its commitment to wait until the evidence was more clear. I think the earliest it could do it is July. When we see the real results for the wages,
people say
hopefully the wages will be big.
Yes,
but we don't know.
I hope so. And some people say that if big corporations raise their wages, it will kind of the trend will affect the whole Japan. Like a trickling effect. Do you believe that?
Well, that's not the experience we've had.
That's true.
There's no evidence for that.
So it will be only within the big corporation like Suntory.
It could be. That's what it was last time.
Right.
So we'll see what it is this time. So I will not predict whether it will or will not. I say, let me wait and see the evidence.
How about the risk of China? Because the reason a lot of foreign investors are investing in Japan because China is too risky. Do you think it's a temporary movement or people are starting to believe that Japan is back?
Well, some people may tell themselves Japan is back. You know, stockbrokers are trying to sell stocks.
Yes.
So they have a story.
Yeah, they love to sell
Politicians like to say, we don't need to do any reform because we're back already. So they like to tell that story.
Right.
Other people like to believe it for wishful thinking or whatever otherwise. Japan is not back. There are trends that could cause Japan to be back, which is what my book is about.
Yes.
Right? But they're not here yet. The government is not doing the right things, but there are trends in society that are very, very good. But that take a while to play out. Now, foreigners are fleeing China.
Yes.
And I think either Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, I think it was Goldman Sachs was saying, China is no longer the place to invest. It's India.
India.
But there's two kinds of investment, right? One is if you just buy stocks. That's one kind of investment. The other kind of investment is you build factories or you build offices or you build computer centers or you buy them and improve them. And that kind of investment is not occurring in Japan because it's very hard to buy a Japanese company that's a member of a corporate group. And so I did an article on this some years ago. Out of 196 countries, in terms of the amount of foreign direct investment, that means actually creating something or buying an existing company, improving it. Out of 196 of a total amount compared to GDP over the years, Japan came in 196th. Just behind North Korea because it was getting Chinese investment. Now I think it's like, 193rd. So it's just, So the stock investment is money that can flow out as easily as it flows in.
Yes.
But if you actually buy a company and improve it, or you build an office, or you build a computer center or a research center or a factory or whatever, that stays.
Right.
And even if the company sells it, what they built.
We're not seeing the real growth of economic growth, like building factories, building products, innovation, not yet.
No.
So let's talk about your book because if Japan is not back, we want to know what the obstacles are and how we can change that. So your book about the contest for Japan's economic future, entrepreneurs versus corporate giants. What's the most important message you wanted to deliver by writing your book? And I read it. It was a fascinating book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it will be out in Japanese later this year. The most important message is that Japan could be back if it does the right things. And a lot of the right things are happening in society. If you look at the top level, what the government is doing, things on the surface, it looks so static and depressing. But if you look at changes in society, generational attitudes, it's really quite exciting that people creating companies, younger, ambitious, talented entrepreneurs, technological changes, the growth of e-commerce. So there's a whole bunch of changes that are going on, which if they become big enough, really have the capacity to change Japan, to have a recovery through having the kind of entrepreneurship that Japan had in the high growth era of new dynamic companies. So those are positive changes, but they need to be amplified by government policy. So far, the government is resisting. It says it's doing it, but it's not. But the message is, yes, we can. Japan can do it. It can come back. We should not all be so fatalistic, shikatakanai, right? We can do it. Or not we, I'm not Japanese, but Japan can do it. I'm saying Japanese people can feel we can do it.
Could you give us some example, the positive change happening like entrepreneurs or startups?
Okay. First of all, by entrepreneur, when people think entrepreneur, they think Silicon Valley and high tech. But actually, that's only a very small sliver. There are about 2,000 high-tech companies in Silicon Valley. There are 50,000 high-growth companies. They're nicknamed gazelles after this very, very fast and agile antelope in Africa. They're called gazelles. 50,000. Maybe they grow from 50 people to 200, and they innovate and they create ideas. So you walk into meetings with these people. And first of all, you never used to see graduates of Keio, Waseda, Todai, Kyoto University, Tsukuba, creating companies. Now you do.
That's true.
And they're very ambitious and they're very excited. and they're mostly men because of the discrimination against women, lending, whatever. Okay. They really have ambition and they have ideas that will make Japan better. So let me give you two and they're not all in high tech. Let me give you two examples.
ピボットアプリでは料理をしながら学べるバックグラウンド再生が可能です。通勤中や仕事の途中、家事の途中、いつでもどこでも学べます。さらに様々な特典と交換できるピボットマイルもありますので、ぜひ使ってみてください。ながらで学ぼうピボット。詳細は概要欄のリンクをチェック。
There was a guy named Miyamoto, and he worked for an American consulting firm called A.T. Kearney. And he ended up creating kind of an Uber for parcel delivery before Uber even existed. Because you have the big companies, that Yamato, etc.
Yamato, yes.
But the last mile is 30,000, truckers, small companies, and the trucks are only 40% full. In Europe, they would be 60 or 70% full. If you could fill them, the drivers could earn more money, the customers could be cheaper, and less carbon emissions per package, because now each mile you're carrying more packages.
Right.
So how do you do it? He created a website that was an auction system where the trucker, some butcher or flower shop or anybody needs to deliver stuff to another company within the city. And they say, is anybody going near this route? And the trucker says, yeah, I'm going near the route. I can stop there and add more package. So they had signed up, when I was there, about 1,500 companies. They were on the stock market, and now they think they'll become $1 billion sales company by 2030. But here's what's interesting. So the guy who created it was only 1 year out of Keio. So he had a vision, but he didn't really not know how to manage a company. Usually people who got at least Kacho level are managing companies.
Right.
So he was losing a lot of people, a lot of high turnover. So he needed to hire veterans. In the old days, it would be very hard for him to hire. People would not want to leave.
No, they'll stay in the same company.
Same company. Yeah. Now, easily, he hired guys in their early 30s from bigger companies, from the HR department, human resources. They came here and they solved his problem because they said, how do you talk to people? Don't just talk about money. Talk about what's the mission of the company. How are we making Japan better? Another case of very interesting was a 42-year-old community organizer in Tokushima who realized there are all these food deserts in Japan because the depopulation, the town cannot support a grocery store.
Right.
Old people can't drive. So he created a truck. He didn't build it, but he bought designed a truck, carries 1,500 items, and it gets items from the supermarkets and brings them to town, all over Japan. And people come out now and they buy items from the truck. And it's a Japanese company because if some old lady who normally comes doesn't show up, the truck driver will call the authorities and say, check on her.
Is she okay?
Is she okay? Right? So now the supermarkets could have thought of this, but they didn't. And the point is, entrepreneurship is not about high tech. It's about seeing a problem and then seeing the solution. And the old companies, not only do they not see the solution, they don't even get the problem. That's what makes an entrepreneur.
Right.
But these people they want to build something that's going to help Japan, help other people. They want to have a fulfilling life, an interesting career.
Yes.
And they're getting not only young people joining them, but men and women in their 40s.
Leaving big companies.
And I said, why? They said, because this is my last chance to do something interesting in my career, to build something. So fulfillment, ikagai, is becoming a big deal in the culture. So that is very, very exciting.
Yeah. So the two examples are very exciting. So what are the most important lessons we can learn from that example? Because you made an interesting point, because when we think about innovation, we think about Silicon Valley, like creating the apps or engineers, but it's a different image of innovation. What's the important lesson we can learn from that two examples?
That, first of all, innovation is really, as I said, it's about seeing problems and then seeing the solution. That's one thing. The other thing is, when the government thinks about innovation or recovery, they think of very exotic. artificial intelligence
yes.
and superconductivity.
Super high tech, yes.
And nanotechnology.
Right.
But actually, if you look at Japan's economy, so many of the business sectors are actually very, very inefficient by world benchmark standards. So how do you raise them to world benchmark? Two things. One is competition. The biggest force for improvement is not corporate governance, it's competition. Ford is putting out electric vehicles because of Tesla. And maybe Japan will change because of BYD.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Competition. And then using technology to take ordinary businesses like parcel delivery and make it more efficient. The same thing with construction and retail and all sorts of other things. Very, very interesting example. So in the US, in parcel delivery, these are all parcel delivery. But anyway, with something called big data, when a truck is going to break down or a car is going to break down, there are certain signs that sensors can pick up. One is temperature rises and there's certain stress factors. Now you don't know why, what's the cause, but you know it's going to break down. So if you wait for the truck to break down, and then you got to send another truck after it, and then switch all the goods, and then tow truck bring it back, the company loses a lot of money. People get their packages late. The company's got to pay money in penalties. But if you say, hey, this truck's in trouble, you send another truck out, you shift the packages, people get their stuff on time, and the truck that's got a problem can drive back itself, and then you can find out what the problem is. So United Parcel Service in the US does it. Nissan Leaf in Japan had done it. Unfortunately, Nissan did not really continue to improve the Leaf to keep it competitive.
Right.
But until 2019, it was the biggest selling EV in the world.
Yes.
And Nissan created the EV. You know, people forget how innovative Japan is. 3 of the key technologies that are fighting global warming were developed in Japan. Solar panels to become commercialized, lithium-ion batteries.
That's true, yeah.
Right? And electric vehicles.
Yes.
Except that Japan is not using them.
No.
So there's technical brilliance, and then there's commercial brilliance. And Japan is still very good at technical brilliance, but applying that to commercial products kind of lost its way in the digital age.
How can we be good at commercial business?
Well, that's what I think new companies come in. Because in every country, old companies have the old company disease. They find it very hard to change their ways. Now, it's worse in Japan because of the system of lifetime employment and promotion from within, which used to be very helpful for Japan. Now it's not. Which is, suppose your senpai was involved in TV. And now, because you're promoted because of him. And now you're Sony and you're losing $1 billion a year on TVs. But if you abandon those TVs, are you betraying your senpai? So it's harder to shift. Something about new companies, they're not tied to old ideas. They have new ideas. So you look at Toyota. Toyota knows that the key to competitiveness, one of the keys is software and electronics, but it does not have the in-house skills to do it. So Toyota now has more software vendors than parts makers among its first-tier suppliers. But these are independent new companies. They do not join the Toyota group. They don't want to. They don't want to be subordinates. They want to be partners. They want to be independent. And they want to be able to collaborate with anybody, including Toyota's competitors. And Toyota had to accept these conditions because it lacked in-house capacity. So technology changes the political balance of power and the social balance of power in society. Lots of companies, because of e-commerce, can do this, changes it. So one company makes furniture, Tansonogen, and the founder of it did not believe in e-commerce. He wanted brick and mortar stores. He got sick, he had to retire, and unfortunately he died 2 years later. But his children took it over, and they believed in e-commerce, and they joined Rakuten. And in only 16 years, their sales went up 16 times. That's just amazing, right? And so, which means why? Because it used to be new companies could not get to their customers because the distribution system is controlled by the incumbents. But e-commerce, you bypass it. So the political power of technology is immense. And it means that now Toyota and other companies like that, they now are not sure what's the best way. Are they for entrepreneurship or against it? Well, they want enough entrepreneurs that they can partner with, but not so many that might challenge it or replace it or take market share. And then if you ask different people in Toyota, different people will have different answers. This creates a political opening for improving entrepreneurship.
So in your book, you mentioned a lot of obstacles for startups. I think it was lifetime employment, distribution you mentioned, and finance. Which one of it is changing or which one is still there?
The recruitment problem is greatly eased because of the generational change. Companies are able to hire smart people with experience and veterans. So that's much easier.
People start moving from big corporations to startups. Do you think that will happen?
Oh, I think it's been happening more and more because the new people bring in some fresh ideas. Because these companies, if everybody thinks the same, how do you change? You want to bring in some people who think differently.
Yes.
So, and that is one of the trends that will absolutely continue.
Do you see a change happening?
What Japan needs to reform, there's a cautious optimism, cautious hope that things are really there, can be done, and smart people know how to do it. So don't lose hope